Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's daunting to attempt anything in front of such an erudite and accomplished audience. I have studied nothing that you have studied. I'm absolutely classic foot soldier in the media, which has, of course, played its own part in stoking hubris and massaging charisma. I woke on the morning of Saturday, the 1st of November, to the joyous pleasure of seeing the FT lying on the doormat. And one of the best things about the FT on a Saturday morning is lunch with. And who should it be lunch with that day but Richard Branson? Now, of course, only a little later on, I had the radio on. Of course, the lead story on the radio that very morning was the crash of his unfortunate spacecraft, which he says in this piece would be flying within months, carrying paying passengers into space. At 64, the entrepreneur adventurer is going strong. Over garlic chicken in Manhattan, he tells Andrew Edgecliffe Johnson about taking his business into space, the art of delegation and hoping his brand outlives him. Mr. Branson appeared on Channel 4 News on the following Monday morning, by which time he had not yet managed to compose himself. He was a battered and depleted Richard Branson. Excuse me if I take my jacket off, it's warm in here. He was a battered and depleted Richard Branson from the one we're more used to. And I thought at times was close to tears. But one thing was different, and that was that he was not being treated the way he was used to being treated. And the way he's used to being treated is, of course, the brand. And the brand, he's a very fascinating study because he doesn't, in fact, have that much charisma, but he has a good deal of hubris. And is not actually even particularly articulate. But he has done something which almost nobody else has done, and that is to build a brand out of nothing, which is now a very, very substantial brand which provides a great deal of something. Although he is not himself actually providing the something, he's providing the charismatic element of it, perhaps, which is the delight in Virgin. It's a formidable brand, and he was the first person, I think, in many ways, to cotton on to the fact that if you really wanted to succeed in business, you had to identify yourself. And that's what he did. He identified himself through the brand, and he is the personification of the brand. And of course, in that moment, he realized that the brand had crashed. Not necessarily disastrously, although it had actually killed the unfortunate pilot. The other pilot had made a positively Branson-esque recovery, amazingly, managing to eject and fall 10 miles from space and live with a broken shoulder, and apparently no other damage. And many is the time that Richard Branson himself has made the same journey, but in a more business-like sense, rather than falling from the clouds. But I think Branson is a very handy starting point from which to try to sort of think about the media's involvement in this game, because it is substantial. There's no question whatever that a lot of hubris is very handsomely stoked by the media, and that is the deal. And on that Monday morning, I wasn't stoking. I was hitting. I was asking him about how it was that he'd managed to forget the name, or indeed even the identity, or the fact that he'd ever met the unfortunate dead pilot. The dead pilot had actually done nothing short of actually flying the initial probe. This very first flight that ever went was driven by this guy. So it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't remember him, but he wanted not to remember him in this instance, and indeed wanted him to work for another company other than Virgin. Actually, the company he worked for was one that Virgin had taken over, but still had its own name. So it was a sort of one of these very interesting moments during which the brand needed to retreat rather fast, and he needed to present himself in a rather different kind of a way. And it didn't altogether work. It was not the normal Richard Branson. It was not a reassuring Richard Branson. And I asked him why he was already back in Necker his island, not perhaps comforting the bereaved families, although how much comfort that would have been is hard to imagine. But at any rate, he said, well, the reason I'm back here in Mecca is because I'm arranging the next big conference of the elders, who are these people like Kofi Annan, etc., who have formed a collective of wise men and women who preside over things, and he's very cleverly got himself involved in that, in facilitating them, both in terms of moving them about in flights and providing a meeting place for them. So that became suddenly more important than the issue of what had happened to his spaceship. But undoubtedly, in that interaction that we have with people like, and there are not many people like Richard Branson, they're an unusual breed, the media does play an absolutely critical role. And when I say that, the media in fact plays an uncritical role. I mean, critical in the sense that it's a big role, but uncritical in the sense that there's very little cross-examination because Virgin's such fun. We'd all like to fly it, we'd all like to go into space, we'd all like to listen to the music, we'd all like to watch the TV channels, we'd all like to listen to the sport, and there we have our whole life packaged up for us by Richard Branson. So, interestingly, the media doesn't really challenge him very much because they don't particularly want to lose out on access to these interesting areas of life. I'm not talking of any corruption or anything like that, but people identify with the bits of the Branson empire that they themselves rather enjoy. I mean by that, when I say people, media people. So then I began to think, well, you see, I'd originally approached this thinking about political leadership, but then I thought about business leadership, and I was brought up short specifically by Richard Branson. I'd like to introduce you to an altogether contrasting figure, one of the most successful businessmen I've ever met, one of the most inspiring and least charismatic and least hubristic businessmen I've ever met, and his name's Paul Polman. Paul Polman is not somebody most people in this room probably ever heard of, but he runs Unilever, and Unilever is becoming rapidly a sustainable empire of activity. Of course, we all know it for the Lifebuoy soap and the foodstuffs and the other stuff that they produce. But interestingly, they've set themselves extraordinarily tough targets of sustainability in production, sustainability in sales and delivery, and they set percentages year by year that they have to reach, and they're reaching them. And he also is driving forward an initiative on trying to introduce a kind of benchmark for ethics in business. But he has no charisma. I wouldn't say he had. That may be a naughty thing to say, but not particularly charismatic, and certainly not hubristic, but unbelievably inspiring, committed, driven, and very clever at getting his message across. So here are these two contrasting figures. And then I thought about the next bit that we might examine. That would be football. I see football is a very, very big part of people's lives. It's not a big part of my life. It wouldn't be in yours if you supported Brighton and Hove Albion as I do. And I've had very little to do with football. And I've done very few interviews with people who play football. But I have interviewed Alex Ferguson. And Alex Ferguson is an absolutely brilliant manager, no question. I mean, towering force in the game. But interestingly, has a vulnerability, and that is that he doesn't like to be challenged. And for 7 years, after being challenged by the BBC, he refused ever to allow the BBC into a press conference that he gave. And through this, I began to understand how some of these people in sport work. Basically, a sports journalist, and here we come back to the media's role in the whole question of the interplay between hubris and the media, the sports journalist must get into these press conferences, must be able to say they rubbed shoulders with and heard and even asked Alex Ferguson about the matter of the day, how that extraordinary penalty went awry and drifted off away from the left-hand post. They want to be able to say in their copy that they got first-hand accounts from the great man about what happened. And so the idea of behaving in such a manner that you might get kicked out of this place and have no access is a very damaging state of affairs indeed. What kind of a football correspondent can you be if you have no access to Alex Ferguson? Well, I've never had any access to Alex Ferguson until he wrote a book. Now, one could say that writing books about oneself is in itself a hubristic activity. I have written a book about myself, so I can completely identify with it. My hands are clean or dirty, whichever way you want to put it. But Alex Ferguson had written a book and had opened himself up to being interviewed by anybody. And I was one of anybody. And I turned up and we sat down and I said, what is it? You are a godhead. You are a sporting godhead. Why are you so thin-skinned? How is it that you can't cope with criticism? And he was completely flummoxed. He did not know which way to turn. It was a completely disastrous yet uplifting and extraordinary interview. Again, I sort of saw our role. If I'd sat down and said, Mr. Ferguson, you just are special. This is fantastic. We would have had, a perfectly satisfactory, and I would have been able to guarantee that I could go and watch a Manchester United game, and maybe he'd have even said, do feel you can pop up and see me in the box. And, well, actually I'd pay good money not to have to go to any professional football match, but there it is. I'm beginning to try and explain to you that there is this insidious relationship between the media and hubris. We need each other. We need in so many ways, the people we report have got to be larger than life. And that was what was so revealing about the telephone call, which you've already alluded to, between Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I had the good fortune to be the correspondent on duty that day when the phone call was made. I was in Washington. And I knew how it looked from the other end. And from the other end, it looked as if the Americans didn't even know there was a British Commonwealth, let alone the idea that the island of Grenada might be a member of it. So the thought that Mrs. Thatcher had to be telephoned to be told that they were invading the British Commonwealth island of Grenada, which the Americans, and I suspect the British too, had a bit of a difficulty locating, let alone knowing very much about, was quite extraordinary. But suddenly I was being told by London, Britain is absolutely infuriated with what's happened. Mrs. Thatcher's on the ceiling. The smoke is pouring out of the telephone lines to Washington, etc., etc. So I went to the White House thinking, my God, this is going to be quite something. And, of course, we reported it like that. The Iron Lady showed her mettle that day. She stood up to the American president and said, how dare you enter our territory in that way, etc., etc., etc. And then we get the phone call. As sweet and charming, avuncular old grandpa is rumbling along. And oh, well, I'm so sorry. I thought I'd leave my hat at the door. I feel so humble in your presence on the phone and the rest of it. And you can hear the sort of, well, so who talked of purring the other day? Well, she purred. And there was a Thatcher purr going on down the phone. And it was the most extraordinarily one-way traffic of conversation. Was it not, Polly? We would agree. She was completely retreated, and as I said, a pussycat. And literally purring, and by the end, instead of saying, well, I really do hope it won't happen again, Mr. President, she said, and do tell me, how is Nancy? But it didn't fit our vernacular. She was the Iron Lady and had to be reported as such, and he was the slightly dotty President of the United States, who often didn't know what day of the week it was. And so that's how it remained. But he sure knew what day of the week it was that week, and he behaved on the phone in a perfectly sort of standard kind of, I'm awfully sorry, I really didn't know kind of thing, and we should have called you and everything and the rest of it. So that, I think, is a very neat insight into our need for Mrs. Thatcher at all times to be the Iron Lady. Of course, I had thought that hubris was really a man's thing, but I'm afraid Mrs. Thatcher proves the bisexuality or the twin sexuality of hubris. I don't know whether she had charisma. I find charisma very difficult to identify. I think it's a difficult, you psychiatrists and people in the audience, I'm not sure it's a term that would be of great attraction to you, because it's in the eye of the beholder as much as anything else. And the beholder isn't your patient. So that doesn't really help very much. But hubris is much more interesting. And I would argue Mrs. Thatcher had every element of hubris that any man could possess. I mean, I liked Mrs. Thatcher, and I interviewed her about 20 times. The score was Thatcher 20, Snow 0. She would always want to be. I interviewed her a lot. I was a diplomatic correspondent, so I interviewed her a lot at European summits. Now, the thing about European summits is Mrs. Thatcher wanted to get home as soon as possible. The fewest possible nights in Europe were the better nights, even though her nights were never longer, as we now know, than 4 hours. But at any rate, she would always want to get home, and I was in Madrid, where she just signed, of course, the most dramatic act any British Prime Minister ever signed about Europe, the Single European Act. It was 2 in the morning. The poor old pilot had been got out of bed to get to the tarmac and the rest of it, and we hacks had to stay up until 2 when she would do the interviews. And I remember being outside the little room where she and Bernard Ingham, her assistant, were waiting, and I knocked on the door, and I walked in, and she had the good old double whiskey in her hand, and it was very sweet. She said, "Oh, John, how perfectly lovely to see you." And I thought, my God, she knows my name. And of course, in that moment, my own hubristic tendencies began to rise to 7, until I realised that Bernard Ingham had clearly just sort of turned over to her and said, "Prime Minister, Jon Snow, frightful bastard, Channel 4 News." So you would have this, and how are you, and all the rest of it. And then the camera would roll, and you would say, "Prime Minister, here we are in Madrid, 12 members of the European Union in those days, and it's still Britain against the 12, even though you've signed Britain against the 11, you've signed the Single European Act. But is this really a sensible way to conduct diplomacy in Europe?" She said, "What a perfectly stupid question." Now, that in fact was a very hubristic answer. It was a perfectly sensible question. And had I had my wits about me, I'd have said, "I'll ask you any damn question I want. It's my job to question you and yours to answer me." But of course, no way. One was steamrolled by the hubris. The room was awash with it. It was impossible to do business with her because she spoke a language which simply didn't play with one's normal conduct of conversation with people. If you can be told immediately that it's a stupid question, you're immediately down on the floor being hacked to death by the stilettos and the rest of it. And so, thinking about Mrs. Thatcher, I began to think, what can we learn then from other political leaders? Ted Heath was a charisma bypass. And certainly I would not say he suffered from any hubris. I think anybody who could have a yacht with no loo door is not a man who suffers from anyway. And so he was very easy to do business with. I don't think Wilson was hubristic or particularly charismatic either. Callaghan, well, Polly and I disagree a little bit. I asked her about it earlier. She thought he was a little hubristic, and that he'd, in seeing off Barbara Castle, it had been manifested in that way. And possibly she's right, I agree. But then you see, it's this whole question of how the media treat people. If you think of John Major, we rubbished him practically the whole of his premiership, and yet he survived a remarkably long time as Prime Minister and wasn't a bad Prime Minister, actually, when it comes down to it. David might disagree, but there we are. But he wasn't a bad Prime Minister and has been a beauty in retirement, and yet he, of course, has been a board member of Carlyle, which is good old weapons and electronics and all the other things which poor Mr. Blair has got into trouble for, that sort of stuff too. But John Major, not at all, because in fact we found him a delightful man to deal with in retirement. Blair is a more interesting and complex, which as this is not on Chatham House rules, I wouldn't venture to come up with many solutions there. But I do remember standing there in the festival hall at 5 o'clock in the morning in that blue dawn of a new morning of British politics in 1997, and genuinely thinking, my father was a bishop, but never mind, I left in brackets, that the risen Christ had arrived. There was a real sense that something, but Blair was something new. He was packaging. He was brilliant packaging. I don't think there was particular hubris, actually, in those early days. There was certainly, I don't think, any particular charisma. I don't think there's any charisma now. In fact, he's interestingly haunted now. It's a very fascinating journey from risen Christ to haunt. It's a journey which is too complicated for these proceedings, because we could devote the entire time to an inspection of that journey. But the problem for the media is that if you deal with boring people who are not interested in playing the game, and interesting, if I go back to Paul Polman, he never does interviews. I've never seen him on the media or anything like that. And indeed, he has no profile in this audience. And yet he controls one of the biggest worldwide global corporations in the world. We need people to play ball with, particularly in television. We've got to, and for people to play ball, they have to have a bit of hubris. Now, a good example, of course, is Nigel Farage, who is not charismatic at all. And so much so that people would be more than happy to have a drink with him in a pub. Charisma is a difficult thing to handle in a pub, and he doesn't have it, so that's fine. What he does have is fabulous hubris. He has this extraordinary sense of overweening confidence and certainty about who he is and where he is, and it's paid absolute dividends. And we've had a field day. We can't get enough of him. I mean, that's why they're doing so well. The media simply cannot get enough of this hubris. It is such fun. He will talk about anything, absolutely anything. And he will do it tonight, tomorrow night, the next night, and he's doing frightfully well out of it. I know I'm getting late on. I've got I've got a minute or two left. I think in this discussion we have to recognise that the media are in the doghouse when it comes to hubris. You know, you can't really strut your stuff unless somebody is interested in connecting with it. And are we interested in connecting it? You bet your bottom dollar we are. It makes for great television, especially when, of course, it comes on the 1st of November, or the 3rd of November, as was, in the form of Richard Branson with a collapsed spacecraft, just after he's had the best page in the FT extolling his new space endeavour and the rest of it. I mean, it's our meat and drink, and without us, a lot more hubris would be punctured. But we spend our time trying to puncture hubris, but we don't want to puncture it too badly because we want to come on again next week. Thank you very much.